I'm going to show you how to run a vRO workflow. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and click the bell so that you don't miss a thing.
In this video, we're going to see how to run a vRO workflow. But as an added bonus, we're going to learn how to run a special kind of vRO workflow known as a configuration workflow. So let's do so in the lab environment. Okay, let's run a couple of workflows. Now, in a video or two, you'll get to write your own workflows, but a good place to start is learning how to run somebody else's workflow. So what we're going to do is start by going to Library, Workflows. And in Library Workflows, in previous videos, I showed you how we have a hierarchy of workflows that you can run. There are hundreds and hundreds of workflows out of the box when you first install Orchestrator. Now, the workflows are visible in different views. So for instance, I've been showing you the hierarchical view, which you get to by clicking on this button here. That's a great view for beginner Orchestrator developers to use. But we can also see workflows by using these other two view buttons, such as this view here shows you workflows as tiles or cards or whatever you want to call these. So for instance, here we have a workflow here, just randomly picking one that when we run it allows us to validate a database. I don't know what kind of database, I don't know what the validation is, but if I run that workflow, it's going to validate a database. So in this view, I see workflows as tiles. In the next view, I see the exact same workflows, but instead of being displayed as tiles, they're displayed as a list. And notice, by the way, if you scroll down to the bottom of the list, that we have numerous pages of workflows. So the workflows that you see here right out the starting gate on this one screen are not all the workflows. There's over, as I've said, hundreds of workflows already in your Orchestrator server. Before you even write your first one, there are hundreds already available here. And again, the third view is this hierarchy view, which is well suited for beginners. Speaking of that view, if you haven't already done so, rather than put your workflows into this library folder, I recommend that you create your own workflow folder for storing your workflows. Library is the workflow folder where VMware and third-party companies put their workflows. You should create your own workflow folder by clicking Workflows, then clicking the New Workflow button. But we didn't come here to create workflow folders or workflows. We came here to run some workflows. So we're going to do that by clicking on Library. And the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into the vCenter plugin folder. And if we scroll down a bit here, as you can see, there are lots of different subfolders to organize the different types of workflows that the vCenter plugin supplies, including we have some here for, let's find it, where is, virtual machine management down on the bottom. And again, we have some more subfolders. Virtual machine management, power management has various workflows to allow us to do things like start up and shut down virtual machines. So we can start up a virtual machine, we can shut down a virtual machine gracefully, or we can rudely power it off using power off machine and wait. So let's do this. Let's open up another tab so that we can actually see that what we're doing is actually doing something. I'm going to open up the vSphere client, and in here, I'm going to log in. I'm already logged in. I'm going to log in and go to the VMs and templates view. And let's go find a machine. I'm just randomly picking one here. For instance, here's SA-Ansible. And you'll notice that currently that machine is powered on. But if we want to power it off, we could go to Orchestrator. And here in Orchestrator, if we find the workflow to power off, or better yet, gracefully shut down the machine, we can choose to run it. So I'll select the workflow and click Run. And whenever you run a workflow, you're very likely going to be asked some questions. These are known as inputs, or if you're an old crusty Orchestrator developer like me, you call these input parameters. But in this case of this particular workflow, it wants to know the virtual machine that you want to shut down. Well, if you just click here in this field, it pops up a window, and I can go browse my way through to find the machine that I want to shut down. But notice that my Orchestrator server inventory of vCenter or vSphere objects is completely empty. Now, this brings me to that special type of workflow I said I was going to talk about. If you want to do things in Orchestrator, you typically need to run the configuration workflow for one or more plugins. For instance, one of the plugins is called the vCenter or the vSphere plugin, and I can tell by looking at the screen here that that plugin has not been configured yet. So I know we're jumping at the chance to actually shut down a machine, but before we're going to be able to do anything vSphere related, we need to first of all configure the vSphere plugin. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to cancel, and I am going to expand the navigation bar over here. And just as a quick little aside, another way I could tell that the vCenter plugin is not configured involves this thing called the inventory. If I go to the inventory, expand the vSphere plugin, you'll notice that it's currently empty. So what we're going to do is go back to Library Workflows, and in Library Workflows, either using the tile view or the list view or the hierarchy view, one way or another, I'm going to find a workflow to do what I need to do. And right now what I need to do, before I'm going to be able to do anything with virtual machines or data stores or resource pools or anything, what I need to do is go to my plugins configuration folder. Almost every plugin nowadays has a folder called configuration, and in there it has one or more workflows that you can use to configure the plugin. For instance, in the case of the vCenter plugin, I need to add a vCenter server instance. Otherwise, Orchestrator doesn't know where my vCenter server is. So let's run it. I'm going to select Add a vCenter server. I'll click Run. And again, this workflow is going to ask me for some inputs. Now, in the case of this particular workflow, it's got a lot more inputs than the previous workflow. The previous workflow just asked me which VM I wanted to shut down. This one's asking me all sorts of questions. In fact, it's asking multiple questions across multiple tabs. Later on in this video series, I'll show you how to create inputs. I'll show you how to break them up into different tabs and so forth. But for right now, let's try to answer the minimal number of questions here. I don't want to turn this into a great big complicated discussion about all the questions here. So let's just focus on the few things that we need to do. So when running this workflow, I need to give it the FQDN or IP address of my vCenter server. Helps if I type it correctly. Let me try one more time. SA-VCSA-01 is my vCenter server. It's in the vclass.local domain. I'm going to connect to it on port 443. Later on in this class, later on in these videos, we'll talk about what /SDK means. Yes, I'm going to orchestrate. Yes, because I'm using self-signed certificates, I want to ignore certificate warnings. You should talk to your security folks to see whether or not you should check this checkbox. If you're using self-signed certificates, you'll need to check this checkbox. If you're not using self-signed certificates, you probably do not want to check this checkbox. But again, check with your security team. So I've answered all the questions on this tab. I'm going to go next to the Set Connection Properties tab. And here it wants to know, first of all, something about, do I want to use session per user or some other choice? That's a common question that you're going to see for lots of different plugins. I'll explain what it means here in a moment, but let me uncheck it for the moment. And I'm just going to type my credentials. So I'm going to authenticate, Orchestrator is going to authenticate to vCenter by using this username and the credentials that I'm about to supply here. So super secret credentials typed in right there. So in the easiest configuration, you'll uncheck the session per user checkbox and simply give the username and password for an account in vCenter that Orchestrator can use to log in whenever an Orchestrator workflow is running that's doing something in vSphere. Orchestrator's got to log in. So here's the credentials. The checkbox here, if you check it, allows you to say, instead of having just one set of credentials that Orchestrator always uses for all the different Orchestrator users, if you check this checkbox, then what that means is Orchestrator will, instead of using the same credentials for everyone, Orchestrator will log into vCenter using the credentials of the Orchestrator user who's running the Orchestrator workflow. So you can do it either way. Again, to start things off simple, we're going to leave this checkbox unchecked, and all the Orchestrator workflows that do things in vCenter are going to use these credentials. As you can see, we have another tab for additional endpoints, but we're just going to go with the defaults here, and we're going to click Run. But just before we do, if you didn't understand all those inputs that we just answered, that's totally fine. If you get nothing else out of the current part of this discussion, all you need to know is that you select a workflow. Right about here, it's not showing up on the screen right now, but right about here, there'll be a link that says Run. You click that, you answer whatever inputs the workflow asks you, and then you click Run. The Run button, not the Run link. And this here is what's known as the schema of the workflow, and I can tell as the schema updates, I can tell where we are in the workflow and what's going on. And additionally, up top here, I can tell that the workflow has successfully completed running. So it didn't say failure, doesn't say currently still running, it says completed. And completed, green, means successful. Now, what we're looking at here, we're going to talk about in a moment, but specifically what we're looking at on this screen is something known as a workflow run, formerly known as a workflow token. We'll talk about those in a moment. But all I'm looking for here in this particular case is to confirm that it says completed, which it does. So I'm going to close this workflow run, and you'll notice I'm taken back to the workflow. And having done that, again, if I expand my navigation bar and go to the inventory once again, if I go to the vSphere portion of the Orchestrator inventory, notice that now it's able to see into my vCenter inventory, including somewhere right around here, here's that SA-Ansible machine that I showed you before. And we can see things about it such as it's currently powered on. So now that we've configured the plugin, we can start doing things with the plugin. So let's go back to Library Workflows. And again, I'm going to go back to Library, vCenter. We've run the configuration workflow. If I ever need to change the credentials to log into that vCenter server or change other things about the connection, I can use the Update vCenter server workflow, or if I ever decommission a workflow, I can unregister it. But for our purposes right now, I'm done configuring the workflow. Instead, what I'm going to do is go to vCenter, Virtual Machine Management. I'll expand Virtual Machine Management, and then under Power Management, we've got that workflow I showed you earlier called Shutdown Guest OS. And you'll recall when I attempted to run it before, I clicked on Run. It asked me one input, but when I clicked here, it couldn't find any VMs. It couldn't find any vSphere objects. But now that I've properly run the configuration workflow, I can click here, and I see the inventory. If I expand into the inventory, we'll talk about exactly how this hierarchy is laid out in a later video, but if I keep drilling down, I can find a VM, select the VM, and if I click the select button, that will pick that VM, and then I can run the workflow. But to make certain that this is actually proving to you that this is working, I'm going to go to the vSphere client here to show you that the machine is currently powered on. I'll go back to the vRO client. I'll select SA-Ansible. I'll run the workflow. I'll rush back to the vSphere tab and watch real closely here. And as you can see, the SA-Ansible machine has powered off. And once you learn the technique that I've shown you here to stop a virtual machine, you should be able to power on a virtual machine. So I'm going to go back to my Orchestrator client tab. Again, I'm looking here at something called a workflow run. I'm going to click close. And so that it's really clear where I am, expanding the navigation bar. I'm back in Library Workflows, and we're going to run another workflow, but this time we're going to run a workflow called Start virtual machine and wait. We'll talk later on about what and wait means, but just think of this as the start virtual machine workflow. If we run the workflow, this workflow has two inputs. It wants to know which VM do you want to power on, and optionally, it wants to know what host you want to power it up on. Currently, that VM is powered on host it's not powered on right now, but it's registered, it's associated with host number 3. But watch, as I go back to Orchestrator, I'm going to pick that same VM again. Again, we'll talk later on in the video series about this hierarchy of objects here. But I'm just going to go find that VM again, select it, and instead of having the machine power, that was a little too quick, instead of having the machine power on host number 3, I can optionally change it to boot up on another host. So let's select the other host. See, this time I'll go into the host folder, not the VM folder, because I'm looking for a host. SA03, oh, interesting. It's not on my compute cluster, my Ansible servers in my management cluster. It's currently associated with host number 3, but let's power it up on host number 5 and see what happens. 6. We'll select host 6. We'll click Run. And as you can see, the workflow is currently running. By the way, the reason why you see this schema flip-flopping back and forth is it's one workflow is calling another workflow, which is calling another workflow. You'll learn to understand the schema and what this is trying to show you. But notice that if you look at a schema, you can tell which schema element is active by the green highlighting that you see here. So as you get more accustomed to working with this workflow run screen, you're going to be watching for which schema element is green, because that's where you are in the workflow. And you're going to watch up here to see what state the workflow's in. Now, you saw earlier that this workflow is called Start Virtual Machine and Wait. I'll explain later on what it's actually waiting for, but notice that this workflow doesn't say it's completed until something special happens in that virtual machine. Specifically, what happens in that virtual machine that causes this to stop waiting here and progress to the end. Notice the end schema element is now highlighted. What this was waiting for was for VMware tools to start in that virtual machine. But I like this example because it lets you see several different workflow states. So a workflow can be running, a workflow can be completed, a workflow can have failed, a workflow can be waiting on user input. So we'll talk more about these status possibilities later on. But I'd like to talk, let me hit close. I'd like to talk about these things called workflow runs. Again, these were previously known as workflow tokens. I mention workflow tokens because you're going to see both terms used, whether you hear people talking about them or you read documentation. Even though the current proper name is workflow runs, you should be accustomed to seeing workflow runs or workflow tokens and understand that those are the same thing. But if you go into Activity Workflow Runs, it will display for you a separate entry in here for each time you run a workflow. So remember, a few moments ago when we ran the first workflow, we ran add a vCenter server instance. And then the next workflow we ran shut down guest OS and wait. And I told you that behind the scenes, it was calling another workflow. So for each workflow that gets run, and each time we run a workflow, a new workflow run or workflow token gets created. So here we've got 3 workflow tokens, 3 workflow runs, which if we select them, let me click on one of them, will show you the schema of the workflow. It will give you information about what was happening with the workflow, including, yep, it's completed running. And additionally, there's a variables tab we'll talk about in more detail later on, showing you the values of all the inputs, all the outputs. There's a logs tab that will show you any logging messages that are being spit out by the different schema elements in this workflow, plus a performance tab that you can use to when you're trying to optimize the performance of workflows and you need to know, okay, what part of this workflow is the thing that's consuming so much time? Maybe I can optimize that. The Performance tab lets you do things like that. Another thing to know about these workflow tokens, also known as workflow runs, is if you click on workflow, if you're looking at a workflow run and you want to run that workflow again, if you click run again, not only will it run the workflow again, it will pre-populate all of the answers that you gave previously for all these inputs. Every single input that you ever type is saved, cached, so that we can do this. The one exception is password fields. For obvious reasons, we don't want to cache the passwords. If I really want to run this workflow again, I could do so. I just need to type this password again, then click run. Join me in the next video, where I'll show you how to create a simple vRO workflow.